One rainy night, a CEO walks into his own fast food chain. Just another customer picking up a pizza. But what he sees stops him in his tracks, a delivery driver. Soaking wet, eyes filled with tears, being berated by his manager. The CEO says nothing, yet. But what happens next will shake the entire company to its core. Rain pelted against the windows of Tony's Slice, a small but bustling pizza joint tucked between a laundromat and a convenience store on a dimly lit street in Chicago. Neon lights flickered against the wet pavement, reflecting the hurried steps of late-night customers dodging puddles as they rushed inside. The air was thick with the scent of melted cheese, garlic, and dough, a warm contrast to the biting chill of the storm outside. David Langston sat in the corner near the pickup counter, his coat still damp from the rain. He was here to pick up a simple pepperoni pizza. Just another customer in the crowd. No one in the store recognized him as the CEO of the very company that owned Tony's Slice. That was how he wanted it. He watched as a digital screen above the counter blinked with order numbers. And employees in matching red polo shirts shuffled between ovens and delivery bags. It was a routine he had seen countless times from boardrooms and financial reports. But tonight, he was here to see it firsthand. A loud voice cut through the kitchen noise. "Are you kidding me? 20 minutes late again?" David turned his head toward the source. Mike Sanders, the store manager, stood behind the counter, his face flushed with frustration. In front of him was a delivery driver, young, wiry, still dripping wet from the rain. The name tag on his jacket read John Miller. John stood stiffly, his fingers curled around the strap of his delivery bag. His soaked uniform clung to him, his breath still heavy from biking through the downpour. The customer called, pissed off. Mike continued, voice sharp. "They said their pizza was cold. You think I need that headache?" John swallowed hard. "I got stuck in traffic. The rain. Spare me the excuses." Mike snapped. "The rule is 20 minutes. And you were 20 minutes late. That's on you." David's fingers tightened around the napkin dispenser in front of him. He stayed quiet, listening. John tried again. "Look, I rode as fast as I could. The streets are flooded. A car almost hit me trying to go around the backed-up traffic on." Mike leaned in, voice dropping into something even colder. "If you can't handle the job, maybe you shouldn't have it." A few employees paused mid-task, glancing at the scene but quickly looking away. No one stepped in. John opened his mouth, then closed it, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He nodded stiffly, pressing his lips together. "I understand." David exhaled slowly. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. A familiar kind of anger, controlled, calculating. He stood, picked up his pizza box, and walked toward the door, passing close enough to see the way John's hands trembled slightly at his sides. As he stepped out into the rain, David made a decision. This wasn't over. David Langston sat in his car, the windshield wipers swiping back and forth against the steady drizzle. The pizza box on the passenger seat had long since gone cold. Forgotten the moment he left Tony's Slice. His mind replayed the scene at the store. The sharpness in Mike Sanders' voice. The way John Miller had stood there, shoulders tense, absorbing every word like a man with no other choice. He pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine. But he didn't move. His house was quiet, dark, the kind of silence that should have been comforting after a long day. Instead, it felt heavy. He finally exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before stepping inside. David walked past the untouched dinner he had planned, straight to his study. He sat down, opened his laptop, and logged into the company's internal dashboard. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, only that something felt off. And he needed to understand why. He started with the simplest search, customer reviews. Within seconds, a flood of complaints appeared under the profile for the Tony's Slice location he had just visited. Drivers were rude, orders took too long, pizza arrived cold. But then, mixed in between the usual gripes about missing toppings and soggy crusts, there were more troubling comments. Delivery drivers looked exhausted, like they hadn't slept in days. One customer wrote about seeing a driver nearly collapse on their doorstep. Another claimed they felt guilty complaining about a late order when the driver told them he had already been working a 14-hour shift. David scrolled further, his frown deepening. A handful of reviews mentioned drivers speeding through intersections, barely avoiding accidents. One even described watching a Tony's Slice driver swerve to avoid a collision, only to wipe out on a patch of ice. The driver had limped back to his scooter, dusted himself off, and rode away. And yet, not a single official complaint had been logged in the company's internal records. David leaned back in his chair, the pieces clicking together. If these complaints were real, and they certainly seemed to be, then either the drivers weren't reporting their experiences, or someone was making sure those reports never reached the higher-ups. He needed to dig deeper. His next search was for employee turnover. The numbers didn't make sense. Over the past 6 months, the location had gone through more delivery drivers than any other store in the city. The resignation rate was nearly double the company average. David pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts before landing on a name he hadn't spoken to in a while. Eric Vasquez, a former delivery driver who had worked for Tony's Slice for nearly 2 years before suddenly quitting. He hesitated for a moment, then hit call. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Wary, yeah? Eric, it's David Langston. There was a pause, then a shift in tone. Oh, wow, CEO calling me. Didn't think I'd ever see that day. David let out a short breath. I need to ask you something about the store you worked at. The one on Halsted. Eric went quiet for a long beat. Then, his voice came back, edged with something colder. I don't work there anymore. I know, David said. That's why I'm calling. What happened? Eric sighed. I don't know how much you actually hear from guys like us. But that place? It's a damn sweatshop. Mike runs it like a prison. Hours get pushed longer and longer. But pay doesn't. Miss a delivery window? You get your hours cut. Customer complains? Your tips magically disappear. Think about reporting it? Mike makes sure you don't have a job anymore. David's grip on his phone tightened. And you're saying this has been happening for a while? Yeah, Eric said bitterly. And not just to me. There was a rustling sound on the other end of the line. Like Eric was shifting in his seat. Look, I'll be honest. I tried complaining. Thought maybe corporate would do something. But when nothing changed, I got the message. David's jaw tensed. You sent a report? Yeah. To who? Eric scoffed. Who do you think? But you know what's funny? They said they never got it. David felt his pulse slow. A cold realization settling in. Never? Nope. It was like it disappeared. Just like every other complaint anyone ever made about that place. David exhaled, running a hand over his desk. It wasn't just that drivers were being mistreated. Someone was making sure their voices never reached the top. Mike's been covering his tracks. Eric let out a dry laugh. Yeah, and he's damn good at it. David glanced back at his screen. At the list of past employees. The complaints buried under customer reviews. The missing reports. His mind was already moving ahead. Planning. Eric, he said, voice firm. If I push this, if I bring this to light, will you back me up? There was a long silence. Then, a quiet chuckle. Yeah, I'd love to see that bastard go down. David nodded, even though Eric couldn't see it. Good, I'll be in touch. He hung up and turned back to his laptop. This wasn't just about Mike anymore. This was about the system that let people like him thrive. And David wasn't going to let it stand. David Langston arrived at the corporate headquarters of Tony's Slice just before dawn. His coffee untouched as he stared at the city skyline from his office window. The morning buzz of Chicago had already begun, traffic lights changing in rhythm. Pedestrians bundled against the wind, the distant sound of sirens breaking through the hum of the waking city. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying every piece of information he had gathered the night before. At precisely 8 a.m., the conference room filled with the quiet murmurs of his senior staff. Sarah Mitchell, head of quality control, took a seat near the front, flipping open her notebook. Across from her sat Greg Townsend, director of human resources, looking slightly puzzled by the urgency of the meeting. David noted the wary glances exchanged between team members. Something about this didn't sit right with them. Good, it wasn't supposed to. He cleared his throat. We have a problem, he said, his voice even but firm. And before you assume this is just another operations meeting, let me be clear, it's not. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. Last night, I visited one of our stores. I watched a manager berate a driver in front of customers. I saw an exhausted employee, soaking wet, too afraid to speak up for himself. And then I started digging. He turned toward Greg. How many official complaints have we received from delivery drivers in the past 6 months? Greg hesitated, then pulled up a file on his tablet. None. David raised an eyebrow. None? Greg nodded. At least, none that reached us. If there were any, they didn't make it past store-level management. Sarah leaned forward, her expression tightening. That's impossible. I've read customer reviews mentioning exhausted drivers and late orders. Something isn't adding up. David tapped his fingers on the table. Exactly. Which is why I checked our internal reports this morning. He turned the screen of his laptop toward the group, displaying a series of statistics. Our turnover rate for delivery drivers at this location is almost double the company average. In the last 6 months alone, over 20 drivers have either quit or been terminated. Greg frowned. That's unusual. David nodded. It gets worse. The number of reported accidents involving our drivers has spiked, but not a single one was filed as a workplace incident. That means they weren't reported to corporate, weren't documented for insurance, and weren't handled with the protocols we have in place. A tense silence settled over the room. Greg exchanged a glance with Sarah before speaking. If complaints were made and never escalated, then someone is blocking them at the store level. David folded his arms. That someone is Mike Sanders. Sarah exhaled sharply. I knew he was aggressive. But covering up accidents? That's criminal. David's gaze sharpened. We don't know how far this goes yet. That's why I want IT to pull any deleted emails or reports connected to that location. Greg, I need you to discreetly reach out to past employees. See if any of them are willing to talk. Greg nodded, already scribbling notes. Sarah straightened. I can get an internal perspective. If I apply as a prospective employee, I can see firsthand how that store operates under Mike. David studied her for a moment. Are you sure? She gave a small, tight smile. I'm not exactly new to field investigations. And I'm not afraid of guys like Mike. David nodded, then checked his watch. I also have a meeting set up with a former driver later today. Let's see what he has to say. By noon, David was seated in a quiet cafe, waiting for Carlos Ramirez. The man arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a hoodie pulled low over his forehead. He scanned the cafe before sliding into the booth across from David. You really the CEO? Carlos asked, studying him. David gave a small nod. I am. Carlos snorted, shaking his head. Man, I thought this was a joke. Why the hell would a CEO care about a couple of pizza drivers? David leaned forward. Because it's my company, and because what I found out last night, what I suspect, is unacceptable. Carlos studied him for a moment, then sighed. All right, you want to know the truth? He leaned in. Mike doesn't just overwork people. He steals from them. Tips that customers give online? Half the time, drivers don't see a cent. He finds excuses. Says a customer complained. Says the system glitched. But we all know he's pocketing the cash. David's expression darkened. And no one reported it? Carlos let out a dry laugh. Reported it to who? Mike runs that place like a damn dictatorship. You push back, you're out. You even think about calling our. He makes sure your next paycheck gets lost. David's jaw clenched. And the accidents? Carlos' face hardened. Happened to my buddy, Alex. A car hit him while he was rushing to make a delivery. Broke his wrist. You know what Mike told him? Clock out and don't come back. Said if he filed a claim, he'd never work another job in food service again. David inhaled slowly, controlling his anger. Carlos tapped the table. You want to fix this? You gotta go bigger than just Mike. This ain't just one bad manager. It's the whole damn system letting guys like him get away with it. David nodded, already knowing Carlos was right. This wasn't just about one store anymore. It was about everything. David Langston stepped out of his car, the morning chill cutting through his coat as he approached the Tony's Slice location he had visited just 2 nights ago. This time, he wasn't an anonymous customer picking up a pizza. He was here as CEO. He wasn't here to observe from a distance. He was here to make his presence known. The store was already busy, the scent of melted cheese and tomato sauce wafting through the glass doors. He pushed them open and stepped inside. The din of conversation and kitchen noise carried on as usual, But he noticed the subtle shift the moment the employees spotted him. Conversations died down, movements stiffened. Behind the counter, Mike Sanders stood near the register, checking order slips. He was talking to a crew member when he caught sight of David. For a brief moment, his expression faltered, just a flicker of recognition and tension in his jaw. Then, as if flipping a switch, he plastered on a professional smile and walked over. "Mr. Langston," Mike greeted, his tone carefully neutral. "What a surprise. Didn't expect to see you here so early." David met his gaze with measured calm. "I like to check in on my stores from time to time. Thought I'd see how things are running." Mike nodded, the smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We always appreciate upper management taking an interest." David let the words hang for a second before responding. "That's exactly what I intend to do." He stepped past Mike and walked toward the kitchen. Scanning the operation, orders were being prepared with the usual efficiency. The pizza makers worked swiftly, tossing dough and layering ingredients under the fluorescent lights. The front-end employees stayed focused on the registers, carefully avoiding eye contact with him. Then the front door swung open with a gust of cold wind, and a delivery driver stepped in, his shoulders hunched, his uniform soaked from the rain outside. His name tag read Ryan. He was young, maybe early 20s, with dark circles under his eyes and a weary set to his posture. Before Ryan could even shake off the water from his jacket, Mike turned on him. "You're late," Mike barked, loud enough for the whole front end to hear. "What the hell took so long?" Ryan flinched, his fingers tightening around the strap of his delivery bag. "Traffic's bad with the rain," he said, voice edged with exhaustion. "I rode as fast as I could." Mike scoffed. "Fast as you could? The order tracker says you were 10 minutes late. You think customers care about the weather? You think they're gonna wait around for a cold pizza?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "I'm telling you, it wasn't possible to go any faster." Mike cut him off. "Then maybe this isn't the job for you." The room felt heavier. The kitchen crew kept their heads down, pretending not to hear, but David saw the way their hands slowed on the prep line. Their shoulders tensed. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. David took a step forward. "Mike," he said, voice level but firm, "is that how you talk to all your employees?" Mike spun around, startled. His composure cracked for just a moment before he forced it back into place. He straightened, his hands moving to his hips. "I'm just making sure they do their jobs. Sir, we have standards to uphold." David held his gaze. "Standards don't mean much if they come at the cost of basic decency." Mike chuckled, though it came out strained. "With all due respect, Mr. Langston, this is a fast-paced business. If we let things slide, we lose customers. I can't afford to have drivers taking their time." Ryan opened his mouth as if to protest, but he hesitated, glancing between the two men. David didn't break eye contact with Mike. "So tell me, Mike, how does that explain the spike in accidents? Or the turnover rate at this location? You've had more delivery drivers quit than any other store in the district." A flicker of something crossed Mike's face. Not quite panic, but something close to calculation. "We expect a little turnover in this business. It's part of the job." David nodded slowly. "And what about the accidents?" Mike exhaled sharply. "We push for efficiency. Some drivers take risks. That's on them." "Is it?" David took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Mike could hear. "Because I have reason to believe those accidents weren't random. That drivers have been pressured into working under unsafe conditions. And that complaints about this store never made it past your desk." Mike's nostrils flared, but he forced himself to stay composed. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," David said. "It's an observation." Mike's hands twitched at his sides, his fingers curling slightly before he unclenched them. "I don't know where you're getting your information, but I can assure you, we follow all company policies." David didn't reply right away. He let the silence stretch, watching as Mike's carefully controlled mask started to slip just enough to confirm what he already suspected. Mike was hiding something. What he didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell, who had applied for a job at this location just that morning, was standing near the back, casually wiping down a counter. Her phone was in her apron pocket, discreetly recording every word. David finally exhaled and took a step back. "I'll be following up on this location personally." he said, "and I expect full cooperation. Understood?" Mike forced a nod, his smile tight. "Of course." David glanced at Ryan. The young man looked stunned, as if he'd just witnessed something he never expected, a manager being challenged in real time. David nodded once. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out into the rain, already knowing one thing for certain. This was bigger than just Mike Sanders. David Langston sat at the head of the conference table in the corporate headquarters of Tony's Slice. His fingers interlaced as he scanned the faces of his senior staff. The room was filled with the quiet hum of computers booting up, papers being shuffled, and the occasional throat clearing. No one spoke. They were waiting for him. He let the silence linger a moment longer before leaning forward. "We have a problem," he said, "and it runs deeper than just one bad manager." Sarah Mitchell from Quality Control sat up straighter, her notepad open. Greg Townsend, head of our, adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable. Across the table, Ben Carter, the company's legal counsel, tapped a pen against his folder. Waiting. David pulled up the company's internal dashboard on the large screen at the front of the room. "I've spent the last 24 hours looking at the numbers. Accident reports, employee turnover, customer complaints, and what I found is disturbing." He clicked a button, and a set of charts and statistics filled the screen. "In the past 6 months, our Halstead location has had the highest turnover rate of delivery drivers across the entire chain. Twice the number of resignations compared to any other store in the district." Greg frowned. "That can't be right. I don't remember seeing any reports about excessive turnover from that location." David's gaze sharpened. "That's because there weren't any reports. At least, not ones that made it to us." He clicked again, pulling up another file. Customer reviews mention exhausted drivers, complaints about aggressive management, even references to dangerous delivery conditions. But when I checked our official HR records, I found no corresponding internal complaints. Sarah flipped through her notes. "That doesn't make sense. Employees complain all the time, even about minor things. There's no way no one filed anything." Greg shifted uncomfortably. "Unless someone made sure those complaints never left the store." David nodded. "Exactly. That's why I asked IT to dig deeper." He turned to Adam Chen, the company's head of IT security, who had been quietly reviewing his laptop. "What did you find?" Adam exhaled sharply and swiveled his screen around. "We ran a data recovery process on deleted emails from the Halstead store. And we found these." A series of emails filled the screen, messages from delivery drivers, detailing unfair treatment, withheld wages, and dangerous work conditions. Some even referenced specific incidents of drivers being forced to work in hazardous weather or having their tips confiscated. But there was something else. All of these emails, Adam said, were redirected to a single account before being deleted. He clicked on a name. Mike Sanders. A tense silence spread through the room. Ben Carter leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Are you telling me that every single complaint filed at that store was intercepted by the store manager himself?" Adam nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And not just complaints. We also found records of deleted accident reports. One in particular caught my attention." He clicked again, and a document appeared on the screen. David scanned it, his jaw tightening. 2 months ago, a delivery driver was involved in a collision while on shift. The report should have been escalated to HR and legal. Instead, it was deleted. Greg paled. "That means it was never reported to insurance. No compensation, no investigation." Ben muttered a curse under his breath. "That's a liability nightmare." David tapped his fingers on the table. "And it gets worse." He turned back to Adam. "Tell them what else you found." Adam hesitated. "Some of the emails we recovered contain threats." Sarah's eyes widened. "Threats?" Adam nodded grimly. Drivers who questioned their pay or working conditions received emails warning them to keep quiet or risk losing their jobs. Some were more subtle, implying that speaking out would make it hard for them to find work elsewhere. Others were more direct. David let that settle in before asking, "And who sent them?" Adam exhaled. "Mike. Every single one." Greg shook his head in disbelief. How the hell did he get away with this for so long? A voice from the far end of the table spoke up. It was Lisa Carter, an HR specialist. She hesitated, then finally said, "Because he wasn't acting alone." David turned to her. Explain. Lisa shifted uncomfortably but met his gaze. I've worked in HR long enough to know when something doesn't add up. There were times we tried to look into complaints from certain locations. But then, they'd just stop. Like someone higher up shut them down. And whenever it involved Halstead, the response was always the same. David leaned in. And what was that? Lisa's voice dropped to a near whisper. That Mike had connections. Ben sat back, rubbing his temple. So we're not just dealing with a rogue store manager. We're dealing with someone protecting him. David stared at the files on the screen, the weight of it settling over him. Mike was bad, but someone above him was worse. He exhaled and stood. We're going to find out who. And when we do, we're taking them down. Greg swallowed. What's the next step? David didn't hesitate. I want a full list of every driver who quit in the past year. We're going to talk to them. If Mike or anyone else tried to bury their complaints, we'll find out. He turned to Sarah. Keep working undercover at the store. See what else you can dig up. Sarah nodded. If there's more, I'll find it. David straightened his tie. And I'm going to have a conversation with Mike. But this time, he won't see it coming. As the team dispersed, David remained behind, staring at the glowing screen in front of him. This was bigger than he'd thought. And it was far from over. David Langston parked his car 2 blocks away from the small cafe. Glancing in the rearview mirror before stepping out, he had chosen this location for a reason, off the main roads. No security cameras directly outside, and a casual enough atmosphere that no one would pay much attention to a group of men sitting in the back corner. He had been careful with the invitations, reaching out through private channels, using trusted intermediaries. If even one of them was still loyal to Mike Sanders, this entire operation could backfire before it even started. Inside, the cafe smelled of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries. The morning crowd had thinned, leaving only a few customers scattered at small tables, their heads buried in laptops or newspapers. In the farthest booth, 5 men sat waiting. David recognized them immediately. Carlos Ramirez, the most outspoken among them, was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, watching the door. Next to him sat Mark Dawson, whose sharp eyes flickered with wariness. Ryan Chen, a younger man with the look of someone who had been burned before, tapped his fingers restlessly on the table. John Miller, the delivery driver who had been humiliated by Mike, gave a curt nod when David approached. And then there was Eddie Navarro, the only one who hadn't agreed right away to this meeting. He sat stiffly, arms resting on the table, as if second-guessing his decision to be here. David slid into the empty seat at the head of the table. Gentlemen, he greeted, lowering his voice just enough that only they could hear. Thank you for coming. Carlos snorted. Didn't think I'd ever see the day when a CEO would ask to meet with a bunch of ex-drivers. David met his gaze evenly. That's because most CEOs don't want to know the truth. A brief silence followed before Carlos gave a small nod. Fair enough. Mark leaned forward, voice hushed. You said this was about Mike. That you had evidence he was covering up complaints. David nodded. More than that, I know he's been blocking accident reports, intimidating employees, and pocketing money that doesn't belong to him. He studied their reactions. But I need more. I need first-hand accounts. Things that haven't been scrubbed from the system. Carlos exchanged a glance with Mark, then let out a slow breath. You're not wrong about Mike. But he didn't do it alone. David's expression didn't change, but his pulse quickened slightly. Carlos continued. Mike has a network. Other managers, supervisors, people who look the other way because they get a cut of whatever scam he's running. Mark nodded. I got into an accident 6 months ago. It was a storm. Roads were flooded, but I still had to deliver or risk getting hours cut the next week. I wiped out on my bike. Hurt my leg. Nothing broken, but bad enough that I couldn't work for days. He paused. Mike told me not to report it. Said he'd handle it. A week later, he hands me a $50 bill and tells me that's my compensation. David frowned. He bribed you to keep quiet. Mark's jaw clenched. It wasn't a bribe. It was an ultimatum. If I took it, I could keep my job. If I reported the accident, I was done. Ryan exhaled sharply. Same thing happened to a guy the first knew. But instead of a 50, Mike just made his shifts disappear until he had no choice but to quit. David turned to Ryan. You worked under Mike longer than the others. What do you know about the money? Ryan hesitated, then leaned in slightly. Mike's been skimming off the top for years. Delivery fees, online tips, anything that wasn't handed to a driver in cash. He found a way to take a cut. Most of us knew it. But what were we gonna do? Complain? He laughed bitterly. He had the final say on hours. If you pissed him off, suddenly you weren't getting scheduled. David processed that, his mind piecing together the picture that was forming. He glanced at John, who had been quiet until now. John, you were still working there up until a few days ago. Did Mike ever threaten you? John stiffened, fingers curling into fists on the table. Not outright, but after that night, the one where you saw him yelling at me, he pulled me aside in the back room. Told me I needed to watch my attitude. That I should be grateful I still had a job. His voice dropped lower. Then he said something else. He said, the higher-ups don't like troublemakers. David narrowed his eyes. Higher-ups? John nodded. At first, I thought he meant corporate. But now? He glanced at the others. Now I don't think he was talking about you. David felt a shift in the room. A tension that hadn't been there a moment ago. He turned to Eddie, who had remained silent the entire time. Eddie finally looked up, his expression conflicted. You're all looking in the wrong place. He muttered. Carlos frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Eddie rubbed a hand over his face. Then sighed. Mike's not the top of this. He's just the guy running the scam at the store level. But someone higher up has been protecting him, making sure no complaints ever reached corporate. David's breath slowed. Who? Eddie hesitated, then said the name that made the entire table go silent. Richard Calloway. The name hit David like a punch to the gut. Richard Calloway, the regional director overseeing multiple Tony's Slice locations. A man with 20 years in the company. Someone who had the authority to override complaints, erase records, and protect managers like Mike. Carlos cursed under his breath. That son of a... Eddie shook his head. You think it's a coincidence that Mike's been getting away with this for so long? Richard knows. Hell, he probably taught him half of it. And you know what else? He takes a cut. David felt the weight of the revelation settle over him. He had expected corruption. He had expected resistance. But this changed everything. If Richard Calloway was involved, this wasn't just about one bad manager. This was about an entire system designed to exploit workers while keeping corporate blind to it. David exhaled slowly, keeping his expression unreadable. He couldn't move too fast. If Richard got even a hint that someone was onto him, he'd start covering his tracks. David stood, adjusting his coat. Thank you, he said, for your time, for your honesty. Carlos glanced at him. So what happens now? David met his gaze. Now, we go after the real target. As he walked out of the cafe, the city around him felt different. The buildings taller, the stakes higher. He wasn't just fighting to clean up one store anymore. He was fighting to bring down the man who had built the system that allowed it to exist. And Richard Calloway had no idea what was coming. David Langston paced the length of his office, the city skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. He had spent years making decisions that shaped Tony's Slice. But this wasn't a business strategy, it was a battle. And if Richard Calloway was the one pulling the strings behind Mike Sanders, then this problem went far beyond a single corrupt manager. He turned as the door opened, and Sarah Mitchell stepped in, followed by Greg Townsend from Our, Lisa Carter from Accounting, and Adam Chen from IT. They settled into their seats, each carrying folders or tablets, the air thick with anticipation. David didn't waste time. What do we have? Adam tapped his screen, bringing up documents on the conference room monitor. We pulled every approval and adjustment made in the system regarding employee complaints, payroll discrepancies, and accident reports in Mike Sanders' store. He paused before delivering the blow. The final approval on every altered record? Richard Calloway. Sarah let out a slow breath. That means every single case where a driver's report was ignored. Every missing accident claim. It all leads back to him. David's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. But confirmation made it real. Greg cleared his throat. It's not just that store. We expanded the search to other locations Richard oversees. The pattern repeats itself. Higher turnover, more injuries, More complaints that never went anywhere. He flipped through a folder, setting a report on the table. If this were one store, we could chalk it up to bad management. But across an entire district? He shook his head. This is systemic. Lisa, who had been quiet until now, shifted forward. That's not all. She pulled up a different set of records. I ran a deeper financial audit, looking at how money moves within the stores under Richard's control. There are unexplained deductions in payroll, amounts that don't match standard company policy. David's eyes narrowed. How much? Lisa hesitated. Hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 2 years. Sarah stiffened. And where is that money going? Lisa tapped her tablet. We traced multiple transactions leading to an external logistics company. Small, regional, nothing that would normally raise red flags. But here's the catch. Richard has an undisclosed financial stake in that company. The silence that followed was suffocating. David sat down slowly, his fingers steepled. So, he's been cutting driver wages, forcing people out, and funneling those savings into a business he profits from. Lisa nodded grimly. And it's about to get worse. She clicked to another document. We found a contract draft between Richard and that logistics firm. If this goes through, Tony's Slice will start outsourcing delivery to his company. That means phasing out all in-house drivers. Greg stiffened. He's trying to eliminate our entire workforce. Sarah's face darkened, and replace them with third-party gig workers who have zero benefits, zero protections, and zero bargaining power. David exhaled through his nose. He had seen aggressive cost-cutting before. But this wasn't just a business move, it was a calculated, predatory shift that would leave employees stranded while Richard lined his pockets. He straightened. How close is this contract to being finalized? Lisa glanced at the date. 2 weeks. David clenched his jaw. That was barely enough time. If Richard caught wind that someone was onto him, he could accelerate the process. Push it through before David had a chance to stop it. Greg leaned forward. What's the play here? We can't just go public with accusations unless we have enough evidence to sink him completely. David nodded. We need to hit him on 2 fronts. First, we turn Mike against him. If we put enough pressure on him, he might give up Richard to save himself. Sarah smirked. And second? David's eyes burned with quiet determination. We find something Richard can't explain away. A money trail, a conversation, anything that forces him into a corner. Lisa's fingers flew across her tablet. I'll keep digging through the financials. There has to be more. David turned to Sarah. Keep playing the new hire at Mike's store. He doesn't know you're onto him yet, which means you still have access. She nodded. I'll see if he slips up. David stood, buttoning his jacket. And I'll make sure Richard knows his time is running out. As the meeting adjourned, he glanced back at the skyline. The battle had just begun. The restaurant was quiet. The kind of place where business deals were made over expensive coffee and overpriced breakfast plates. Sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows over the dark wood tables. David Langston sat near the back, his posture relaxed but his mind sharp. Across from him, Mike Sanders arrived, his movements stiff but calculated. Mike adjusted the cuffs of his blazer, an obvious attempt to look composed, but David could see the tension in his shoulders. The man had built his career on controlling others. Yet today, he was the one being summoned. David didn't waste time with pleasantries. Mike, we both know why you're here. Mike let out a short breath, forcing a smirk. Do we? Because all I know is my boss asked me to breakfast. Should I be worried? David picked up his coffee cup, swirling it slightly before setting it down. That depends. How worried should you be? Mike stiffened for half a second, almost imperceptible, but David caught it. He slid a thin folder across the table. Go ahead, take a look. Mike hesitated before flipping it open. Inside were copies of deleted emails, payroll adjustments, accident reports that had vanished from the system. With each page, the smirk faded. David watched him closely. Those were never supposed to be found. Were they? Mike closed the folder with forced nonchalance, pushing it back. I don't know what you think you have, but this isn't my first rodeo. You think a few pieces of paper mean anything? David leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to cut through Mike's act. You manipulated wages, erased complaints, and buried accident reports. And you didn't do it alone. He let that sink in before delivering the next blow. Richard Calloway has been using you to clean up his messes. But the second this comes crashing down, you know who he's going to throw under the bus first? Mike swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. David didn't let up. Do you honestly believe Richard will go down with you? He'll deny everything. He'll say you acted alone. That you were stealing for yourself. You think he's going to protect you? Mike exhaled through his nose, forcing a chuckle. And you? What? You want me to believe you're looking out for me? David leaned back. I don't care about you, Mike, but I do care about getting to the truth. So here's the deal. I give you a way out. You cooperate. You give me everything on Richard, and I make sure you don't go to prison. Mike scoffed, shaking his head. That's not how this works. You think Richard's just going to let me walk away? The man has connections. If I cross him, I'll be lucky to find work flipping burgers. David smiled slightly. That's the difference between us. You're scared of Richard. I'm not. Mike studied him, weighing his options. The bravado in his posture had started to slip, replaced by something closer to calculation. Finally, he sighed. And if I say no? David folded his hands. Then I take everything I have to the authorities. I let the media run wild with the story. You'll be the face of corporate corruption. The guy who ruined people's lives for a quick buck. Even if Richard goes down with you, your name will come first. You won't just lose your job, you'll lose everything. A long silence stretched between them. Mike exhaled, rubbing his face. I need guarantees. David tilted his head slightly. You're in no position to negotiate. Mike let out a dry laugh. I'm not stupid, David. If I turn on Richard, I need protection, legal immunity, and something in writing that says I'm not walking out of this broke. David nodded slowly. You help me, and I'll make sure you don't lose everything. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second folder. Sign this, and my legal team starts working on an agreement. But you give me something first. A gesture of good faith. Mike hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a USB drive. He slid it across the table. David took it without looking. What's on it? Mike exhaled. Payroll records. Adjustments to driver wages over the past year. Proof that Richard's been skimming from the system. David studied him for a moment before slipping the drive into his jacket pocket. Mike picked up his coffee, taking a long sip. You better be right about this. Because if Richard finds out before you're ready, we're both screwed. David stood, adjusting his jacket. Then I suggest you start hoping I don't lose. As he walked out, the cool morning air filled his lungs. He had what he needed. Now, it was time to take Richard Calloway down. David Langston sat in his office, the dim glow of his laptop screen illuminating the files spread across his desk. The documents Mike Sanders had given him were more than enough to prove payroll manipulation. But they were just the beginning. To take Richard Calloway down, he needed something stronger, something that would make it impossible for the company to ignore. He had already put the first phase of his plan in motion. Earlier that morning, he had sent an internal report to the board of directors, outlining the financial risks of payroll fraud within Tony's slice. He had framed it carefully, not as an accusation but as a warning. If the company didn't act fast, it could face lawsuits, labor violations, and a major public scandal. At the same time, he had sent an anonymous package to a business journalist at the Chicago Tribune. The reporter, Jack Reynolds, had spent years uncovering corporate misconduct in the food industry. David knew that once Jack got his hands on the documents, he wouldn't let go until the truth was out. But Richard wasn't going to sit back and let this happen. Lisa Carter, the company's internal accountant, had been working tirelessly to dig deeper into the financial records. She had been tracing suspicious transactions linked to Richard, and what she found was even worse than David had expected. She had uncovered a series of payments from third-party logistics companies that were supposedly handling deliveries for Tony's slice. But instead of going to operational costs, large portions of the funds had been rerouted to an offshore account under a name that, until now, had meant nothing. But then Lisa had connected it. The account was linked to a shell company, one that Richard had quietly set up under his wife's maiden name. It was textbook money laundering. David had barely finished reading her report when his phone buzzed. Lisa's voice came through, tense and hurried. David, we have a problem. He straightened. What happened? My system just locked me out. David's grip tightened on the phone. Locked you out how? I was finalizing the report. And suddenly, my access was revoked. Not just mine. IT just flagged an unauthorized attempt to wipe financial records from the server. Someone's trying to erase everything. David's blood ran cold. Richard knows. There was a pause. David, this isn't just about covering tracks. If he's trying to delete everything now, that means he's making his move. David's mind raced. Richard was smart. He wouldn't panic easily. If he was resorting to wiping data, it meant he was preparing for something bigger. David exhaled sharply. Get to my office. Now. He ended the call and stood, staring out at the city skyline. This was no longer just about exposing corruption. Richard was playing for survival. And David needed to strike before it was too late. The morning air in Chicago carried a crisp chill. But inside the offices of Tony's Slice headquarters, the atmosphere was anything but cold. The tension was thick, palpable, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. David Langston sat at his desk, scrolling through the morning's headlines. And there it was, exactly as planned. The hidden wage scandal in the food delivery industry. How workers are being exploited. The article was front and center on the business section of the Chicago Tribune. Written by Jack Reynolds, the investigative journalist David had discreetly provided with key documents. The piece didn't mention Tony's Slice by name, nor did it call out Richard Calloway directly. But it didn't need to. The details were damning. Unpaid wages, manipulated payroll systems, a concerning spike in delivery driver accidents. It was just vague enough to avoid legal retaliation but precise enough for those on the inside to know exactly who the story was about. David barely had time to take another sip of his coffee before his phone rang. Greg Townsend from Our. They just called an emergency board meeting. Greg said without preamble. 30 minutes. David exhaled slowly. Good. 30 minutes later, he stepped into the executive conference room. The tension in the air sharper than ever. The board members were already seated, murmuring amongst themselves. Richard Calloway sat at the far end of the table, arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral, but David saw the tightness in his jaw. The article had shaken him. The chairman of the board, Leonard Barrett, cleared his throat. Gentlemen, I assume you've all seen this morning's news. Murmurs of agreement. We need to address these allegations immediately. Barrett continued. This company will not be associated with unethical labor practices. His gaze flickered toward Richard. Richard, as regional director, I expect you to have answers. Richard's expression remained composed, though David noticed his fingers tapping slightly against the polished wood table. Of course, Richard said smoothly. I won't waste time denying that this article is damaging. But let's be clear, this is sensationalized journalism at its worst. The Tribune is relying on disgruntled ex-employees to paint a narrative that simply isn't true. David let him speak. Let him dig his own grave. Richard continued. Yes, some drivers have complaints. That's the nature of this industry. But we pay competitive wages. We provide opportunities. And the supposed financial discrepancies? Misunderstandings at best. Intentional distortions at worst. He spread his hands. This is nothing more than a coordinated attack from people who don't understand how a business operates. The board members murmured again, some nodding slightly. David spoke then, his voice calm but firm. Misunderstandings? He pulled out a folder and slid it onto the table. I'd like to walk everyone through some data. Richard tensed. David continued. Over the past 2 years, payroll records from several stores under Richard's management show irregular deductions in driver wages. Coincidentally, these funds were funneled through third-party logistics companies that, he paused, looking Richard dead in the eye, are partially owned by Richard himself. The room went silent. Barrett frowned. That's a serious accusation. Richard forced a laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. That's ridiculous. Where is your proof? David flipped the folder open, revealing pages of financial statements, transaction logs, and wire transfers. Lisa Carter from our accounting team uncovered these records. And just last night, someone attempted to remotely wipe them from our system. He met Richard's gaze. That someone was you. Richard's composure cracked, just for a second. Then the doors to the conference room opened. Mike Sanders walked in. Every head in the room turned. Richard stiffened. What the hell is this? Mike's usual arrogance was gone. He looked drained but determined. He cleared his throat. I'm here to tell the truth. Barrett raised an eyebrow. And who exactly are you? Mike swallowed. Until recently, I managed one of Richard's stores. He shot a glance at David before continuing. I was the one carrying out the payroll adjustments. I was the one deleting driver complaints. And I did it under orders. He exhaled. From Richard Calloway. The reaction was immediate. Board members turned to each other, whispering. Barrett's expression darkened. Richard, for the first time, looked genuinely caught off guard. That's a damn lie, Richard snapped. Mike shook his head. You can deny it all you want. But I have emails, messages, financial records that prove you authorized everything. Richard's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, pointing a finger at Mike. Do you really think this little stunt will save you? His voice was low, dangerous. You have no idea who you're messing with. David smiled slightly. Actually, he does. Richard turned sharply. David leaned forward. This meeting is being recorded. He gestured to the speakerphone on the table. Everything you've said is on the record. Richard's face drained of color. Barrett exhaled, rubbing his temples. That's enough. He looked at Richard, his voice turning steely. Effective immediately. You are suspended pending a full investigation. Richard opened his mouth to argue. But Barrett cut him off. And if we find that these accusations are true, you won't just lose your job, Richard, you'll be facing legal action. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard slowly sat back down, his face blank but his eyes burning with fury. David stood, straightening his jacket. The battle wasn't over, but Richard was cornered, and now, the real fight would begin. Richard Calloway sat in his dimly lit office, the blinds partially closed, his fingers drumming against his desk. The meeting had not gone as planned. He had expected resistance, had even braced for accusations. But he hadn't anticipated being completely outmaneuvered. Still, he wasn't done. If the company was going to turn on him, if David Langston thought he had won, then Richard would make sure they all went down together. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The voice on the other end answered after one ring. Richard, the voice said, smooth and calculating. I was wondering when you'd call. We have a problem, Richard said, his voice tight, and I need you to handle it. By that evening, the first article had gone live. Power struggles at Tony's Slice. Is CEO David Langston cleaning house for his own gain? The headline was bold, designed to stir controversy. The article painted David not as a reformer, but as a man using an internal scandal to eliminate his rivals. It hinted at backroom deals, secret agendas, and a corporate coup disguised as a fight for justice. And it wasn't the only one. Within hours, more pieces appeared across different outlets, all following the same narrative. David Langston was portrayed as a ruthless executive willing to burn his own company to consolidate power. David saw it coming. He had spent years in corporate warfare, and he knew a counterstrike when he saw one. The moment the articles started circulating, he called Greg Townsend from Our, Lisa Carter from accounting, and Sarah Mitchell from quality control into his office. This is Richard, David said, tossing a printed copy of one of the articles onto the table. He's trying to shift the narrative. If he can't defend himself, he'll make me the villain instead. Sarah scanned the article. They're painting you as a dictator, saying you're forcing out anyone who disagrees with you. Lisa frowned. This is coordinated. Someone fed them this angle. David nodded. Richard has media contacts. He's using them to push this story. But that's not all. He turned to Greg. What's the latest from the board? Greg exhaled. He's reaching out to key board members, trying to convince them you're leading the company into chaos. Some of them are listening. David clenched his jaw. He knew that while he had allies on the board, not everyone was firmly on his side. Some members were neutral, swayed only by numbers and public perception. And right now, public perception was shifting. Then came the real bombshell. Lisa's phone buzzed with an alert. She looked at it and paled. David, she said slowly, this just leaked. She turned her phone so he could see the screen. A confidential document had surfaced online, spreading like wildfire on social media and corporate news sites. It claimed to be proof that David Langston had, at one point, manipulated revenue figures to inflate Tony's Slice's stock value. It was an old tactic, when cornered. Make the other guy look just as dirty. David narrowed his eyes. It's fake. Lisa nodded. Of course it is, but it looks real enough to cause problems. Greg ran a hand through his hair. The board is going to demand answers. Some investors are already panicking. David exhaled. The fight had escalated. It was no longer about internal corruption. Richard had turned it into an all-out war for control of the company. And now, David had to fight back. David Langston stood at the head of the long conference table, the city skyline stretching behind him. The air inside the boardroom was heavy with anticipation. Every executive and shareholder waiting for what would come next. Outside, the media buzzed with speculation. The fight between him and Richard Calloway had escalated beyond internal politics. This was a full-blown corporate war. And now, it was time to end it. His team had worked tirelessly through the night. Lisa Carter, head of accounting, had gone through the leaked document line by line. What she found was exactly what David had suspected: manipulation. The numbers had been altered. Certain transactions inserted that never existed in the original company records. Someone had taken a real financial report and doctored it to make David look guilty. Lisa leaned toward the microphone in front of her. We traced the metadata on the leaked document, she explained, her voice calm but firm. It was modified just 2 days ago, hours before it was leaked. And the source? She tapped her tablet, projecting a file onto the large screen behind her. It came from Richard Calloway's personal work terminal. A murmur ran through the room. Richard, sitting at the opposite end of the table, stiffened but didn't speak. David didn't give him time to recover. This wasn't just an attack on me, he continued. This was an attempt to mislead shareholders, to manipulate public perception, and to obstruct an ongoing internal investigation. He turned toward the board members. And it didn't stop there. Sarah Mitchell, the company's head of quality control, stood and walked to the screen. For the past week, we've been investigating irregularities in the vendor contracts under Richard's oversight, she said. She pulled up a series of documents. One name kept appearing: Horizon Logistics, a company that has received over $3 million in contracts from Tony's Slice in the last 18 months. Richard scoffed, finally finding his voice. And we work with multiple vendors. Sarah didn't flinch. Sure, but what you didn't disclose is that Horizon Logistics is owned by a shell corporation under your wife's maiden name. Silence. David let the weight of the revelation settle. He watched the shifting expressions around the room. Some of the board members looked angry. Others looked concerned. And Richard? For the first time, he looked like a man who had just realized the walls around him were collapsing. David turned back to the table. We've gathered evidence of payroll fraud, financial misappropriation, and now, an undisclosed conflict of interest involving millions of company dollars. He let his gaze settle on Leonard Barrett, the chairman of the board. The question now is simple. How does this company want to proceed? Barrett cleared his throat, exchanging glances with the other board members. Then he exhaled, folding his hands together. I believe we've seen enough. He turned toward Richard, effective immediately. Richard Calloway is suspended from all duties pending a full independent investigation. Richard shot up from his chair. You can't do this, he snapped, his voice laced with desperation. Barrett didn't even blink. We just did. As security entered the room, Richard's face twisted in rage. He looked at David, eyes burning. You think this is over? He hissed. You have no idea what you've started. David met his gaze without flinching. No, Richard. I know exactly what I've started. Richard was escorted out. The room sat in stunned silence for a long moment before Barrett finally spoke again. David, you have a hell of a mess to clean up. David exhaled, finally allowing himself a small nod. Then we'd better get started. Outside, the storm had finally broken. David Langston sat at the head of the conference table, looking out over a room filled with Tony's Slice executives and senior managers. The weight of recent events still lingered in the air. Richard Calloway was gone, but his influence had left deep scars within the company. Eliminating him was just the beginning. Now came the real challenge: rebuilding from the inside out. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together. We have 2 choices, he said, his voice calm but firm. We can pretend Richard was the only problem. make a few cosmetic changes, and hope the media storm passes. Or, we can do what needs to be done. Then, a voice from the far end of the table. Alan Pierce, the regional manager for the Midwest. David, we all agree things need to change. But you're asking us to rip apart a system that's been in place for years. These policies, these management structures, they didn't come from nowhere. David met his gaze. You're right, and that's exactly why we need to fix them. Alan shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't argue. David gestured toward the screen behind him, where a report had been pulled up. Let's start with the basics. Delivery drivers. For years, we've operated under a model that punishes them for circumstances beyond their control. Delayed orders, weather conditions, traffic. None of that is factored into their compensation. Instead, we fine them, penalize them, cut their hours. He paused. That ends today. A murmur rippled through the room. David continued, effective immediately. We're restructuring our delivery compensation model. No more arbitrary fines, no more forced overtime, and if conditions make a delivery unsafe, our drivers will have the right to refuse without retaliation. A voice cut in, Rachel Connors, one of the senior financial officers. David, this is going to cost the company millions in the short term. David nodded. And what's the cost of lawsuits? Of public backlash? Of losing our workforce because they don't trust us? He let that sink in. We either do this now, on our terms, or we wait until someone forces us to. And I promise you, if that happens, we won't be the ones setting the conditions. The room fell silent again. But this time, there was less resistance. Then came the second challenge. Later that afternoon, David received a report from the company's legal team. Several former employees who had been fired under Richard's management had filed wrongful termination lawsuits. They were demanding compensation for lost wages, damages, and in some cases, punitive action against the company. Greg Townsend, the head of our, exhaled as he handed David the document. This could get ugly. We're looking at a drawn-out legal battle if we don't handle it right. David skimmed through the pages. He had expected this. We settle, he said simply. Greg blinked. You want to settle all of them? David nodded. We review each case. If someone was unfairly dismissed, we compensate them. If they were part of Richard's scheme, we fight it. But we don't drag this through the courts. We don't make ourselves the villain again. Greg hesitated, then nodded. Meanwhile, Lisa Carter, the company's lead accountant, was finishing a separate report when something caught her eye. She walked into David's office, a file in her hands. David, she said, I think we just found a way to fund the settlements. David looked up. Lisa placed the document in front of him. Richard was funneling money into a discretionary fund, hidden within vendor payments, expense accounts, and executive perks. It was essentially his personal slush fund. David scanned the numbers, a slow smile forming. How much? Lisa sat back. Enough to cover most of the claims. Maybe more. David exhaled. Richard, in his arrogance, had left them a parting gift. By the end of the week, the board had no choice but to stand behind David's decisions. The company announced a formal restructuring, backed by a financial package that compensated mistreated employees while implementing new labor protections. The immediate backlash from some shareholders was expected. Profits would take a hit in the short term. But David had seen the bigger picture. A stronger workforce, better retention, a company that wasn't constantly on the defensive against lawsuits and bad press. The media caught wind of the shift. The same outlets that had reported the scandal now turned their attention to Tony's Slice's bold reforms. The headlines change. From crisis to reform. How one company is redefining labor practices in the fast food industry. It wasn't just a PR victory. It was the start of something real. As David left the office that evening, he knew there was still work to be done. Policies alone wouldn't fix everything. Culture took time to change. Trust had to be rebuilt. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Momentum. Months had passed since Richard Calloway's downfall, and Tony's Slice was no longer the same company. The storm had cleared, but the rebuilding process was still ongoing. David Langston walked through the headquarters. The atmosphere noticeably different from before. Conversations weren't whispered in fear. Employees no longer avoided eye contact in hallways. Managers engaged with their teams, no longer burdened by the toxic culture Richard had cultivated. Changes weren't just internal. Out in the field, delivery drivers saw tangible improvements. The most significant shift was in the delivery policy. Drivers were no longer penalized for delays beyond their control. If roads were unsafe due to weather, they had the right to decline an order without fear of losing their jobs. Their wages had been adjusted to provide fair compensation, removing the arbitrary deductions that had once drained their paychecks. Transparency had become the new standard. An internal grievance system was introduced, allowing employees to report misconduct directly to an independent review board. No more complaints disappearing into a void. No more unchecked abuse of power. It was progress. Yet, David knew that progress always came at a price. Richard's case had not simply ended with his removal. The legal system had caught up with him, and he now faced charges for financial fraud and labor exploitation. The scandal had drawn the attention of state regulators, who began investigating similar labor violations across the industry. Several of Richard's closest allies within the company had quietly resigned before they could be implicated. Others were under internal review, their futures uncertain. And Mike Sanders? David had kept his promise. Mike had avoided criminal charges in exchange for his testimony. But the fallout had left him marked. No restaurant chain would allow him to hold a managerial role again. He had been demoted to a general staff position at a small, independent diner. It was a second chance, but far from the career he had envisioned for himself. Despite the victories, new challenges emerged. David sat in a boardroom filled with investors and senior executives. The discussion tense. "We've stabilized," one of the board members stated. "The reforms have been good for PR, and customer trust is recovering. But let's be honest, David, our profits took a hit." A senior investor leaned forward. "We need to start looking at expansion again. Faster service, more locations. We can't afford to fall behind the competition." David had seen this coming. The same people who had once supported change were now impatient. To them, ethics were important, until they started affecting the bottom line. "If we expand too quickly, we risk undoing everything we've built," David countered. "The moment we start cutting corners, we'll be right back where we started." A few board members exchanged glances. One of them sighed. "We get it, David, but this isn't a charity. We're in business to make money." David exhaled slowly. This was the fight that never ended, the balance between doing the right thing and keeping the company financially competitive. And then came the news that made his decision even harder. Lisa Carter walked into his office that evening, her expression serious. She set a report on his desk. "Our competitors are making a move," she said. David skimmed the first few lines and immediately understood the threat. A rival restaurant chain had quietly begun recruiting Tony's Slice delivery drivers, offering them slightly higher pay but stripping them of benefits. It was the very model Richard had tried to implement, a workforce of disposable, unprotected contractors. "They're targeting the people we just fought to protect," Lisa said. David sat back in his chair, fingers tapping against the desk. He had won the battle, but the war for fair labor practices was far from over. If Tony's Slice didn't adapt, they risked losing their workforce. If they caved to investor demands, they risked undoing the very foundation of their reforms. The industry was watching. Competitors were waiting for him to fail. David had made many tough choices over the past months, but now, he faced the most important one of all. Would he stay the course, fighting for long-term change, or would he give in to the pressures of profit and competition? The future of Tony's Slice, and perhaps the entire industry, depended on his answer. David Langston stood at the front of the conference room, facing the most critical decision of his career. Around the table, the members of Tony's Slice's board and executive team watched him intently. Some were skeptical, others hopeful, but all were waiting for his answer. The debate had stretched late into the evening. Two competing visions had emerged, each with its own risks. The first, expanding aggressively, prioritizing faster delivery, cutting costs, and reverting to the same high-pressure system that had once ruled the company. It would appease investors but would also undo every reform he had fought for. The second, staying the course, continuing to improve conditions for workers, keeping ethical labor practices at the forefront, and building long-term trust. It was a riskier path, one that could alienate impatient investors and threaten his position as CEO. One of the board members, Leonard Barrett, leaned forward. "David, you know where I stand. This company doesn't exist to make statements, we exist to make money. We're losing market share to competitors who aren't tied down by these so-called ethics." David met his gaze without flinching. "And what happens when those same competitors face the lawsuits and scandals we just barely avoided? We'd be right back where we started." Rachel Connors, the CFO, interjected. "I understand the concern, but our numbers show something different. Consumer trends are shifting. People care more than ever about where their money goes." She tapped her tablet, bringing up a market analysis report. "Customers are actively choosing brands that align with their values. If we stick to our principles, we don't just survive, we lead." A murmur rippled through the room. Some executives exchanged uncertain glances. Then, Lisa Carter, head of accounting, placed another report on the table. "And here's something else," she said. "We've received interest from a major food supplier. They're looking for a brand to partner with, one that represents ethical labor practices. If we prove ourselves now, we could become their flagship chain." The revelation changed the energy in the room. David took a slow breath. This was the opening he needed. "We don't have to choose between ethics and success," he said, letting his voice carry across the room. "We can expand, we can grow, but we'll do it the right way, on our terms." Leonard folded his arms. "And what if that's not enough? What if the investors pull their support?" David met his stare. "Then let them. We'll find new investors who believe in the future we're building." A long silence stretched across the room. Then, slowly, one by one, heads began to nod. Rachel gave a firm nod. "I support it." Lisa followed. "Me too." A few others hesitated before agreeing. Finally, Leonard exhaled. "You'd better be right about this, David." David didn't hesitate. "I am." As the meeting adjourned, he knew that this decision wasn't just about Tony's Slice. It was about setting a new standard in the industry. And he was ready for the fight ahead. Months had passed, and Tony's Slice was no longer the same company it had once been. The storm had settled, but the waves it created continued to shape the future. A new marketing campaign had launched, highlighting transparency, ethical labor practices, and fair working conditions for drivers. Billboards across the city bore the slogan, "Better Pizza, Better People, a Better Way." The message was clear. Tony's Slice was committed to change. Investors who once doubted the reforms were now seeing the results. Sales had not only stabilized but were beginning to climb again. Customer surveys showed increasing trust in the brand. The industry was taking notice. And then came the opportunity David had been waiting for. A major fast food conglomerate approached Tony's Slice with a partnership offer. They wanted to collaborate on a new model, one that combined profitability with ethical employment practices. If the deal went through, Tony's Slice would expand nationwide without sacrificing its values. It was proof that doing the right thing could also be good for business. But victories never came without consequences. Richard Callaway had been officially convicted of financial fraud and labor exploitation. His downfall had sent shockwaves through the industry, serving as a warning to executives who thought they could exploit workers without consequences. Mike Sanders, the disgraced former store manager, had disappeared from the food service world, at least for now. But whispers from industry contacts suggested he had resurfaced, working for a rival chain. David had no doubt he would try to rebuild his reputation. And then there was John. The young delivery driver who had once been humiliated by Mike now stood at the helm of a new Tony's Slice location. His store was a model for fair treatment, and driver retention there was at an all-time high. John had come full circle, from victim to leader. Yet, just when it seemed like things were settling, a letter arrived at David's office. It was unsigned, typed on plain white paper. "Not everyone believes in your vision. Some of us preferred things the way they were. Be careful who you trust." David read the note twice, then folded it neatly and set it aside. He wasn't surprised. Change always had its enemies. Standing by his office window, he looked out over the city. The lights flickered like stars against the dark skyline. He had won this battle. But the war for fairness, for integrity, For real change, it would never truly be over. But that was fine. He had come this far. And he wasn't afraid of whatever came next. At the end of the day, power isn't just about making decisions, it's about making the right ones. David had the choice to ignore what he saw that night, but he chose to fight for real change. His story proves that one moment of empathy can expose corruption. That standing up can shake an entire system. But the question remains: how many more companies are hiding stories like this? How many workers are suffering in silence? What do you think? Should more CEOs step into the real world of their employees? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more eye-opening stories like this one.